So this week we're going to stay focused primarily on 13-week cash flow. I'm calling it part one because we will sort of do a full circle back to part two once we get through a few other blocking and tackling as part of this series. But we love 13-week cash flows. It's super tactical. Most businesses don't even think about cash on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis. Now I know the sort of the topic of the moment of the last few weeks has been, of course, the CARES Act and the Paychecks Protection Program. There's been a lot of like hiccups, a lot of news. Everybody's cramming to get these PPP loans. We've put out some really great articles that, you know, they are a little bit of draconian, and part of planning is to ensure that, you know, you do come out of this with as maximum as possible, you know, maximizing that forgiveness and not being stuck with a loan that is essentially amortizing over 18 months. So at the end of the day, it is a loan. So right now, a lot of companies, fortunately, are getting the PPP money hitting in last week. So we've had customers that started last week or 2 weeks ago, yeah. And of course, the SBA opened up the portal again on Monday. And there's going to be more companies coming at this and more money can hit in the bank accounts. The clock starts and the planning's got to start like yesterday.
Yeah. Our approach with this is not just to maximize the amount of loan you can get or free money that you can get. It's more so how does that fit into your plan, and not just using that money to make, which we'll talk about, but not just to make employment decisions, but make long-term, you know, business strategic decisions. So
right. So this week, PPP money hitting the bank accounts. It's time to start planning for cash. Other topics over the next few weeks. We will dive deeper into the PPP forgiveness planning. We do have some best practices that we are asking customers to put into place to help better track and make it quote unquote auditable. Because like Korey said, there is no free money here. And hopefully maximizing that loan in the context of your business strategy. We'll take a look at 12-month cash flow planning and then some scenario planning and then back to 13-week cash flow planning. So let's just kind of jump into 13-week cash flows. So start planning today, right? So Korey, you want to kind of talk a little bit about the PPP planning?
So once again, to reiterate, like our approach is to focus on the business decisions, not just employment decisions. We've heard a lot of people saying, you know, well, I'm going to get this money, I'm going to bring all my employees back, right? Well, if you're a restaurant or a bar or something that you are still closed down, it doesn't really make sense to bring those people back because if you don't get all of it forgiven, you know, what extra value are you driving by using those funds? So our approach is more so be strategic with it, not just get you to the next 8 weeks or get you through the next 2 months, but really how does this set your business up for success from 6 months from now?
Because ultimately you could actually bring back employees and then ultimately having to lay them off again in 8 to 10 weeks from now. That doesn't make sense, right? None of us have a crystal ball, but we want to be cognizant of, hey, use this money strategically so that one, you're maximizing your forgiveness in sort of the paradigm of your business model and sort of the economic impacts and idiosyncrasies on your business. And then two, making sure that the loan that's left on your books, that you can essentially afford it. Because we do believe that for the average business, this loan could chip away at about 5 to 8% of cash flow margin. And that's a big chunk for companies kind of coming into pre-COVID with very tight margins, right? So planning for the next 6 months, not the next 6 weeks. And we did just put out an article last night or 2 nights ago on the 10 ways to build value with your PPP loan. You know, we sort of really forced the team to think outside of the box. Granted, we all certified that when we applied for the loan, that we were going to use it in good faith to bring back employees, right? To support the business, that your business was suffering. We think we can kind of have our cake and eat it on that. And so 13-week cash flows. The what, the why, and how.
Yeah. So the what, they're 13 weeks. That's the course of 3 months. It accounts for that 5th payroll period in that overlapping month. It's just extremely tactical, right? It's really focused on the timing of cash flows, right? It's not just building a monthly cash basis P&L and seeing where you land at the end of the month, but it's really, where do I land in the week to week? Because right now you're kind of living, many of us are living day to day, week to week, and focus on the timing of those cash flows. So not just where do we end at the end of this month, but do we actually make it through this whole month? Or do we need to change around some of the timing of paying some of the expenses, right? Do we want to wait an extra week to pay back a vendor or a credit card bill because, there's a week that we actually go negative, right? So it's extremely tactical, broken out usually by vendor or top line category, to give us the details that we need to actually plan and make strategic decisions off of that.
And the funny thing is, for a guy who kind of cut his teeth in the world of turnaround and restructuring 10, 12 years ago, 13-week cash flows was essentially the basis for all lending decision-making for companies that were in difficult or dire situations. And when I came into the world of like startups and venture-backed 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago, you work more on long-range planning, 3 years, 5 years, and it's amazing how some founders and management teams really try to develop these 3 to 5 year plans as if they were doing 13-week cash flows. And we would always say, hey, keep it high level, right? Let's not think this. Let's not be overly surgical. 13-week cash flows is like completely the other side. I always tell our customers, like, the next 3-4 weeks has got to be in the bag. In other words, I should see little to no variance in my first 2 to 3 or 4 weeks in my 13-week cash flow. There's always going to be some variances. You always have that customer that promises, yeah, the $10,000 check is in the mail, and then guess what? 2 weeks later, you still haven't received it, right? Or cash is tight and you're pulling back on vendors, right? Because one of the things as a business owner is, there's a few things you never want to miss, right? One is payroll. You always want to make sure you have cash for payroll. But when cash is tight, if you can't meet payroll, then you better then be sure that you're having open communications with your employees and explaining to them the situation and giving them the options to go into unemployment. 13-week cash flow is a great short-term roadmap.
And that's a great example, right? If you find out through that 13-week cash flow, for example, that you cannot make payroll in one of those weeks, well, what are the decisions that you can make along that road before you get to that week that you can delay the timing of cash, right? Or focus on AR and reach out to vendors, ask them to get some money in the door, right? It's focused, once again, all around the timing of everything. Because let's be real, those 5-year projections, what do they do? What question are they solving for? It's to see the potential, right? It's to see what could possibly become, right? Because we all know that second year, by the time you get to that second year, you're completely off.
Right. Good. So let's jump into, several months ago, I think sometime last year, we developed our 10 steps to business modeling, which we've used at Brown University, and we've used in other scenarios, in other situations, And then last December, I think we also developed the 10 steps for 13-week cash flow. So this is pretty straightforward. The details behind each of the steps are on our website, 10 steps to a 13-week cash flow. But let's kind of walk through some of these. And I know we got a printout here just to kind of help.
And we're gonna keep this high level right now while we go through these, and then this just follow along. But this will all make sense when we actually do an example on screen.
So let's start with step 1, Korey.
So step 1, it's a 13-week cash flow. It's like reading a book, right? It's top to bottom, left to right. So from the top, you're always starting with your cash balance. What is your beginning cash balance? We like to start with these on a Monday, right? You can start with them on a Saturday or Sunday, depending on when you can get your reports, formatted. Sometimes QuickBooks only does it on Sundays, right? But we like to start on a Monday, right? Your Sunday night, you are focused on what is my cash balance today, and that's what you use to start your week with. Step 2, it's all about your revenue, right? Starting with your accrual-based revenue. So depending on if you're a cash-based business or you do extend terms to your customers, you can kind of skip some of these steps that apply to you. But let's say that you are a manufacturing company, right? You are extending 30-day terms to your customers. The service or the products that you are delivering to customers today are probably not going to get paid for at least 15 to 30 days from now. Sometimes, depending on the vendor or the customer, 90 days from now, right? It's all about anticipating the accrual revenue based on what you can actually service and produce today, right?
I like to, I always like to start with the accrual-based revenue in 13-week cash flows, because it actually begins to, there's sort of this aha moment with small business owners. Like I generated $100,000 in revenue last month, but I only, on average, it takes me 45, 60 days, which essentially means last month was March. I'm in April. I've yet to collect the revenue for March. And that revenue, I may start recognizing it in cold hard cash sometime in mid-May. That's an eye opener, because on average, if you take the whole month of March, $100,000, you say your starting point is somewhere in the middle of March, the 15th. We're past the 15th of April. That's already 30 days. You tack on another 2 weeks, which is kind of where we're at right now. You're already at 45 days on $100,000 in revenue that you had to pay employees and vendors, rent, overhead, all of that stuff. But that cash is only going to be recognized maybe sometime in mid-May. That's like a total of like 60 days. That's essentially 60 days from the time you paid all your vendors. That's your working capital, right? You hear people talk about cash conversion cycle. That's a very like, wow, you mean from the time I started paying people and paying vendors, recognize that revenue, it takes me almost 60 days to float. In other words, 60 days essentially means 6 times a year you're floating, you're potentially turning your cash. So step 2, start with your anticipated revenue. For small restaurants and bars or cafes or even e-commerce, where you tend to do the swipe, right? You're collecting your money within, call it 5 days from soup to nuts. You know, it's not as relevant, but for most service-based manufacturers, distributors, that cash conversion cycle is pretty damn long.
And why that's also, I'll kind of leave it with this before we move on. Why else is that it's extremely important right now? Let's say that this lockdown does lift in 4 weeks, right? Well, you are not going to, just because your revenue starts increasing does not mean that that is going to flow, right? If there's a 45-day delay on the actual cash collections, you're not actually recognizing that increase in revenue for 45 days plus the 4 weeks that it takes to get there, right?
So you're essentially floating all of that time
for another 9 weeks.
And don't forget, why do people say growing pains? Because growth is painful. It takes cash, right? So if you've had that dip in revenue and now you're starting to see revenue pick up, get ready. That revenue is going to cost additional money. So that brings us to like step 3. It's all about collections. Now in 13-week cash flows, it's not the average company that's looking at it, obviously. But today we're actually seeing companies that have raised $2, $3, $4, $5 million that actually still have $3 million in the bank, and their board of directors are actually asking for 13-week cash flows. A little mind-boggling, right? But it adds a good level of cadence and rigor to these management teams. They're saying to themselves, what's a 13-week cash flow? I'm not going to run out of cash. But the problem is the board doesn't really trust the underlying like market dynamics, and you could end up like burning through more cash and not seeing the revenue coming through. So in step 3, we usually talk about putting your customers into 3 buckets. And I know it's hard to talk about it. We all have customers, but you've got really great customers, and you've got customers that may or may not survive. They may be great people, you have good relationships, but these 3 buckets are essentially high-risk customers, medium-risk customers, and low-risk customers. About 8 weeks ago, when this whole started, our team got together. We were here for a Saturday and a Sunday, and that's the first thing we did. We put all of our customers into these 3 buckets. You know, without naming names, you know, some of the customers that we knew that either one, we had to be proactive. We had to reach out to them and say, hey, we know your situation. We're going to put payment processing on hold. We're not going to collect anymore. We had other customers that we said, hey, we know you may hit a bump in the road. We believe that you're going to survive this. You're just going to need a little bit of help. So maybe let's only collect 50% of the cash and essentially defer the accounts receivable out 3, 4, 5 months. That was our way of helping our customers. And then we have customers that We knew they were going to have the liquidity. We knew they were going to have the loan. So all in all, when you create these 3 buckets and you begin to kind of layer in these algorithms, right, these profiles, you get a sense of what your collections are during this COVID-19 sort of time period.
And it's not just about whether they're slow payers, right? It can be, it's not about the person necessarily, right? It's about the underlying fundamentals of the market too, right? A bar or restaurant, we don't know when they're going to open, right? Doesn't matter if they're good payers or bad payers.
And if they do open, we know that their business model is going to change. So the whole paradigm is going to change. So the cash planning that the bar or the restaurant or the cafe knew 2 or 3 months ago is going to look very different over the next 3 or 4 months. They got to plan for this. So step 4, we go to, now that we know the cash that we anticipate coming in, now we can begin to anticipate the cash that has to go out. So now let's decide on who we're going to pay and when. That comes down to your cost of goods sold, your vendors, your landlords, your electric bill, your utilities. You know, those are the things like there in these times, we're fortunate enough that some of our larger institutional vendors, either through executive order or not, have essentially said, hey, we will forbear you, or we will defer your principal and interest on your mortgage for 3 months. Or the electric company has essentially said, we won't pursue you if you're not able to pay over the next 3 months. So you have a little bit of wiggle room in these times, but that's not always the case. If you have a vendor where you've already overextended 3 or 4 months worth of like invoices and bills, that vendor may end up pursuing you in different ways. So you got to kind of plan. I always say, if you're in these situations, have open and honest conversations with your vendors. Tell them your situation. You need the help. So now that you kind of have a sense of who we're going to pay, how much and when.
One thing I'll layer on top of that for step 4, just get everything on paper, right? Just get everything on there first. Don't start cherry picking up front. You know, I'm going to pay them and I'm going to hold them, right? Just get it all on there. Go through that exercise of seeing who you actually have to pay. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's just so easy to just pay someone because you're in the midst of, you know, business.
Don't pay anyone unless it's on paper. Sure. And then there are little tricks to this, right? You can go, for those that have QuickBooks Online or Xero or other general ledgers, there are great little reports that you can pull that kind of give you a quick sense of like, what are the bills? Sometimes it's called, your accounts payable. Sometimes most companies don't have accounts payable nowadays. Everything is auto debit, ACH. Those are the ones you got to be careful with, right? So now that we know who we're going to pay and how much and when, we need to talk about payroll. You've got a couple of different types of payroll. You've got weekly, you've got biweekly, you've got monthly, you've got payroll that is mostly performance-based, maybe more commission than actual salaries. You've got variable payroll, hourly employees versus full-time employees. Payroll is a big one. Payroll is one that you just cannot forget and you cannot miss. So that's one expense in your 13-week cash flow and in your short-term cash planning. I don't even get off the gates unless I know what my payroll number is going to be.
This is a good exercise because I'm sure a lot of you are thinking right now, well, that's the number I'm trying to figure out, right? How much payroll do I actually have, or how much payroll do I want to have as a function of bringing back employees, right? So it may feel like you start there to a degree, but going through steps 1, 2, and 3, right, to see what you can actually expect in terms of revenue. Now, when you get to step 5, how many people or what people or how much in payroll do I actually truly need to service that revenue, right? Don't just put your whole payroll on there just because you get the PPP, right? How much do I actually need to service the revenue that I just projected in steps 1 through 3?
Right. Now, in other conversations we've had, we do support rehiring employees for the sole purpose of focusing on the foundation of the business, right?
If you can use them,
you can use them, right? Many times it's, yes, there's still some revenue and you need the employees to service the revenue, to produce the revenue. But it also makes sense in times like this when there is this potential investment from the government to support your business, to support your employees. Mm-hmm. It's a great opportunity to fix up the foundation of the business. It could be painting the doors, painting the walls. It could be cleaning up the production area, fixing the warehouse, doing a good solid 5S of your warehouse and distribution center. So
it could be a project that you are focused on for the long-term success of your business, right? If you have software developers, right, and you see a plan in play for the next 2 years, the next year to get you to a better spot, yeah,
it's a good time to bring them on.
use them.
So on to step 6. This is where a lot of companies, especially nowadays with all these SaaS-based programs and vendors, even I know renters are just doing auto debit. I mean, that's one way we maintain our collections too, right? We do require sort of the ability to pull ACH or credit cards. These are these are like the little pitfalls in cash planning, because when it's out of sight, out of mind, you don't really think about it until it's too late. You end up looking at your credit card statement and you realize, oh, there's another $500 that went to HubSpot, right? There's another $100 that went to my web hosting provider. You don't really have the opportunity to negotiate, to delay payment. So those are your surprises that you need to be focused on, and you need to be aware of them. So that's where step number 7, we come into expecting the unexpected. I just had a conversation with a manufacturer, a good customer of ours over the last 2 years. They want to use the PPP money to bring back employees to help accelerate some of the maintenance programs that essentially have sort of gone dark for the last 2 years because they've been really busy. But the problem is bringing back the employees also is going to require some cash to pay for some of the materials and replacement parts. And where's that cash going to come from? So expecting the unexpected. The next step is inventory and inventory planning for those companies that have inventory. That's a tricky one, right? Because in dire times, if you will, when the revenue is so uncertain, the last thing you want to do is to be banking on building out your inventory just to have essentially working capital, real cold hard cash sitting on the shelves. So you want to, again, go back to step 2, anticipating your revenue, being conservative, and then aligning your inventory needs to meet those revenue needs. And that step 9 takes us to actually building your 13-week cash flow machine. Korey, if you want to pop into the spreadsheet and pop that in. And then step 10 is the reconciliation. Step 10, we're going to focus more on step 10 in part 2 of 13-week cash flow, because that's where this becomes that cadence. It becomes a cycle. This is only as good as it being like a living document. If this is not a living document and you're not reconciling this machine every Monday, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So let's take a peek at a model that we like. Perfect. This is a typical 13-week cash flow. And like I said, it does feel overwhelming. And the most difficult piece, I would say, is the actual initial build out. Like I said, you can go to QuickBooks and you can go to Xero and you can pull out some of these transaction reports. I started this particular 13-week cash flow on a Sunday because if you go to QuickBooks, QuickBooks tends to start the weeks on Sundays. So just so that we can align. So when you do pull a cash basis P&L from QuickBooks on a weekly basis, I usually go back 4, maybe 6 weeks in history. Now, in order for this to work, there are some little tricks and things to keep in mind. Like your QuickBooks, your general ledger needs to be, and by the way, if you're going to go into this process of actually doing 13-week cash flow, it is important that the accounting now becomes much more elevated and more critical, because unless the data is actually reconciled to the T in your QuickBooks, which essentially means either 1, your bank accounts are connected to your general ledger, or 2, by Monday mornings, your bookkeeper, your accounting staff has essentially entered all of the cash transactions into your general ledger, you're going to be kind of a sitting duck. So I like to go into QuickBooks, for example, pull a weekly cash basis P&L for the last 4 or 5, 6 weeks, attach it to the beginning of this 13-week cash flow, your beginning cash balance, Essentially, you go into your bank accounts or your balance sheet, depending if everything's reconciled and matched, and calculate how much cash you have in all your bank accounts, and that essentially goes into that first spot where it says 25,000.
And I know it's midweek right now, so if you're gonna, attempt this today, tomorrow, don't start it, midweek. Don't try and retroactively do it as of last Monday. You're gonna find yourselves in a hole. It's gonna be impossible to back out of. Just start it for the next week.
Next Monday. Yeah, start it next Monday. Revenue, that's your revenue, your accounts receivable, depending on the type of business you are. That's essentially how much revenue you expect to recognize. Your operating cash flow. I mean, if you kind of think about the 10 steps, we built it so that it was sequential. Your operating cash collections, that's all the collections that you're making from, that's your cash collections from your AR, sorry. And then you go on to your operating cash flow. Your operating cash flow is everything from your cost of goods sold. So personally, the difference between this and sort of an accrual base, I mean, there's a lot of differences, but one big difference is purchases, right? Inventory purchases. You're not going to find inventory purchases on your P&L for obvious reasons if you're on an accrual accounting basis. But we're not talking accounting, we're talking cash management, and that the purchases of inventory has to go onto your 13-week cash flow. So your cost of sales here isn't analogous to your cost of goods sold that you would normally have seen in an accrual-based P&L. This is the cash that was used to buy inventory to place it into your, which ends up getting booked on your balance sheet. So little nuances here between accrual and cash accounting. If you're on a cash accounting, your life is a whole lot easier when it comes to cash management. For those that are on accrual accounting, it makes it a little bit more tricky. You got to be able to reconcile down to cash, and there's no just one simple report. You have to pull information from different places. Your operating expenses, that's sort of your overhead. One of the things you want to keep in mind here is I always like to lay out what is my top 5 largest vendors. So I actually see my vendors on this. Again, I'm going to reiterate, this is not like a chart of accounts. This is not a P&L. This is not like a gap.
It's not a full-blown vendor list.
And then once you get through your cash that came in from customers, your cash that went out to vendors and to payroll, and et cetera, now you have your financing activities. So for those of you who did get the PPP, for example, you just go in here, type in your PPP, and let's say you got $800,000, and that $800,000 is essentially going to be used as additional free cash flow. And then sometime in the future, either in 2 years from now or sooner, if you decide not to keep the rest of the money as a loan on your books, you would then back out the PPP loan from your financing activities. We would just put a negative number. So for those of you that have lines of credit and you do, you try to keep your banker sleeping at night, you try to take money out of your line of credit when you need it, and you try to put money back into your line of credit when you don't need it. And then at the end of the day, what you're looking at here is your ending cash balance, right? That is, at the end of the day, how much cash do I expect to have in my bank account after 13 weeks? That's the holy grail here. So I'm going to kind of pause. We did a lot. We're going to bring this back in a few weeks because the beauty of this is, again, it doesn't go in your top right-hand drawer for those of you that still have desks and are, sitting on couches or whatever. It's got to be used. It's got to be part of your planning rigor. Okay. One of the things I cannot reiterate enough, especially for small businesses, is that for those that were fortunate enough to receive emergency funding, PPP funding, these are loans. First and foremost, they are loans, and treat them like loans. We don't know what this all looks like in 8 weeks from now. We field calls from customers that are treating this money as if it's just a handout, and it really isn't. It requires a level of rigor and cadence, thoughtful planning, systems, processes, original source documents. In many cases, not even in many cases, the reality is small businesses are being asked to play on a sort of a playing field that they've never had to deal with. They've never had to answer to anyone. God forbid they even had loans, right? Maybe they had a credit card. This is the first time you're asking small business owners to be sophisticated financial managers, and they're just not ready. And so I say, be cautious, be thoughtful. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of gray area. Go try to find a strike zone, stick to the middle, right? Don't stretch. Get your ducks in order, get your documentation. Please don't just 8 weeks from now call your banker and say, I spent $100,000 on employees, I spent $10,000 on rent, and $10,000 on utilities. Here you go. There's more to it, right? There's a lot more to it. And if you stretch, it raises red flags. For a guy who spent time in banking or commercial finance, this is not the time to be stretching.
The quickest, easiest exercise you can all do is what you applied for that PPP. Do yourselves a favor, just pull up like a loan calculator on Google, see what the amortization is. I think we've heard a ton of people saying, I just want to take this, even if it is a loan, because it's 1%. It's 1%, but you're also paying it back over 18 months, right? And that's a huge burden on cash flows, regardless of how much you have, right? Or how much you get out of it. So
a good company that is well run, that has enough buffer going into this on a margin basis, they're still going to experience a 3 to 6% deterioration in cash margin. That's if everything kind of comes back. I don't want to, I promised Amy I was not going to be the draconian, but when we talk about what are the small business needs, it's first and foremost, these are real loans with true consequences.
I have a quick question. You're probably advising people and normally, to have a certain amount of cash flows on hand, 3 months plus 6 months, maybe. How are you working with people now? What are you suggesting? Should they be extending that ramp, or do you feel like, how do people even maintain that, right?
So if you haven't prepared for that potential crisis, that fire, it's probably too late when you're in the middle of it, right? To be thinking beyond like the current paradigm. What we're saying is, for those that are fortunate enough to have received government funding or some sort of government sponsored debt capital, be thoughtful about it. We all agreed that we were going to use for those that received it, you were going to use the monies to bring back employees. But if you don't have a clear view of what regulations are going to look like if you're in the restaurant business, if you don't have a clear view as to whether or not your customers are going to be back in business, if you don't have a clear view into what your revenue generating capacity is going to look like, you really have to look at the money, the capitals that you've received as your rainy day fund. You don't have a choice, because if you burn through it in 8 weeks for the sole purpose of getting it forgiven, you will find yourself in 8 weeks without, 1, any capital, or 2, more debt on the books without a plan for that capital. So it's sort of a godsend for those that weren't able to have good relationships with their small business bankers. It's one of the first things we always say in business: have a good banking relationship. And many of us don't think about it. We just think about our banker as like, oh, that's where I have my checking account. That's where I have my credit card. But your banker is more than that. And maybe I come at this with a different twist. Every small business owner should have developed or should be thinking about developing a relationship with a banker. Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you right now, most bankers don't even have enough time in the day to take your calls. they're working like day and night and through the weekend. I've got a lot of friends in the bank, small business banking, and God willing, they've been helping their small businesses, but they can't take on new customers. They're swamped. Now's not the time, but let's start thinking about that. And if you did get the PPP loan, think about it in the context of not just 8 weeks, maybe 3 months. Some would argue 12 months.
I think the theme here, Avi, to go back to your question in another way, the theme being like, just be thoughtful about it. We have customers that are taking the money, right? Say it's $250,000, right? Taking it and just holding on to it, not necessarily using it and just viewing it as free money and just, spending all of it in the next 8 weeks, but holding on to it and seeing where they land at the end of the 8 weeks or at the end of, 2 months from now, right? There is a 6-month forbearance on it. It does accumulate interest, although it is not, it's deferred. But hold on to it if that's that's how you're feeling. You just want that safety net. And in 2 months from now, 3 months, 4 months, just pay it all back, right? 1% interest over 4 months is not going to accumulate, crazy amount.
Yeah.
So just point being is be thoughtful about what you're doing with it. Don't just spend it all to spend it.
So Avi, another question that that we like to talk about is, what does my business model really look like 3 months from now, 6 months from now? The model that we knew coming into this, and the model that you have to do, is the model going to look the same? Are you willing to change? Can you handle the truth that what your restaurant looked like 4 months ago compared to what it could look like in mid-July and August? Think about it. As soon as restaurants are required to have 6 feet between each table, you're automatically taking 2 to 3/5 of the capacity away from that restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I know people that run a bar that their capacity is going to go from 24 to 6, and that's just not feasible.
That's possible.
But then what is the investment cost to then make that pivot happen, whatever that is, whether you create a to-go product or you go from fine dining to takeout or you start making masks, right?
Or you triple the price of your dining experience.
Yeah, it is another risk. And then how does that impact the long-term vision of whatever product you have too?
Right. It's for those who think outside of the box right now. It's for those that believe that the black swan is actually right ahead. I mean, it's right there. For those that really can actually see beyond this and see the possibilities, that the possibilities is not 50% probability it's all going to go back to the same. Because we can always go back to the same. It doesn't take much to just go back to what we knew. What's very difficult, and it's human nature, right, is to think what is the unthinkable, which is like, I need 3 bar stools between each. So you mean I can't actually rub elbows with my buddy when I'm having a beer? Why am I going to go to the bar?
Cheryl has this quote that I thought was pretty good. Success occurs when opportunity is met with preparation. So I think that kind of sums up in 5 seconds what you just talked about in 50 minutes.
Done. All right. That was a Dan, you're fired.
No, this is fantastic. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.